We often hear in popular discourse, podcasting, journalism, History Channel, so forth, that the Gnostics in particular, they had all these gospels. And ironically, a lot of the scholars who publish these tomes saying that there was no Christian canon early on, publish these Gnostic gospels as the Gnostic gospels or the Gnostic scriptures, when they wouldn't give that credit to the New Testament. Help us out here to see that the Gospel of Judas and the Gospel of Mary and so forth aren't sifted out of a biblical canon. They didn't belong to it in the first place.
Yeah, well, Dr. Kruger has some excellent work published on this particular topic. And a couple of summers ago, I had the privilege to go to a few key locations in Egypt, chief amongst which was Oxyrhynchus. I actually went to Oxyrhynchus and saw some of the work that was being done there currently. But I also went out to Nag Hammadi, and I went to the approximate location that the Nag Hammadi Library was discovered, which revealed documents like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Philip. And so actually in the series that we did at Apologetics Canada, in the first episode, Can We Trust the Bible, episode 1, we talked about the canon of Scripture, and we filmed that actually at Nag Hammadi, and we talked about this discovery and then went to the Coptic Museum in Cairo and looked at the actual few pages that are on there on display of the Gospel of Thomas. And then we went to this little village called Al-Qasr, out in the desert, where the Bedouin who had discovered the Gospel of Thomas actually brought it back to, where it was famously thrown into a courtyard where some goats supposedly ate pages of it, and other pages were of the Nag Hammadi Library were burnt to cook bread, unfortunately. But so what these kind of discoveries, that was in 1945 when that was discovered by an individual named Muhammad Ali. Probably not the Muhammad Ali that the listener is thinking of. Muhammad Ali had nothing to do with boxing. He probably wore a headscarf and hung out with goats more often than he did in a ring with boxing gloves. But those types of discoveries made waves in the theory of this kind of theological quagmire that was supposed by individuals like Bauer back in this German New Testament scholarship, which kind of proposed that there wasn't any one thing called Christianity, but rather Christianities, and that you had groups like the Gnostics and the Ebionites and the Docetics that were all kind of vying for their own theological perspective. And I think what we've kind of developed and discovered now is that, the Gnostics weren't one group as much as they were an umbrella group, and there were multiple different variations of what we call Gnosticism. But despite kind of the variation that existed within the religious or theological perspectives in those religious ideologies, was that they produced these documents that are tied to individuals like Thomas and Philip and Peter and Mary and Judas, names that we would recognize from the Bible. But like I sometimes like to say, that what's happening there is that those groups, which are writing in later subsequent decades and centuries, are appropriating these individuals. They're written in timeframes when we know that Peter and Mary and Thomas and Judas were long dead, and they're appropriating those names, and chiefly Jesus, appropriating the name of Jesus, and writing their own theologies and ideologies back on his lips. And there are multiple ways that we can identify their unreliability in terms of going back to first century Roman-occupied Judea, whereas when we evaluate the biblical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what do we find? We find actually that they mention places and people and names and locations and details that we should expect if they were written in those places at that time. Whereas if you evaluate some of these others, we actually find both in the internal evidence of the names and peoples and places and locations, and then the external evidence in terms of where they start to pop up, some of the clues in their inception as being a written document, that they weren't written in first century Judea. They were written in places like 3rd and 4th century Egypt. And so despite what you might hear in headlines from the Discovery Channel or from your, a popular conspiracy theory YouTube channel, these documents really don't have a credibility in terms of being tied directly to the actual historical Jesus. And the only documents that do are the ones that, unsurprisingly, you would find at the beginning of your New Testament that we call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
That's great summary. I also think one thing cutting across all of these so-called Gnostic Gospels is their defiance of the Old Testament God, whereas the Christians had adopted the Old Testament en bloc, just the whole thing. And also saying, well, it's not as Peter said. They're a joke. Abraham is a joke. Moses is a joke. Not exactly comparable to what you find in the New Testament. But then also, the first commentary on John, if I'm not mistaken, was written by one of the Gnostic leaders' associates, Heraclian. And it's striking that the first commentary on the Gospel of John is not written by an Orthodox Christian, but written by a Gnostic because he knows it's canonical. So none of the Christians referred to the Gnostic Gospels as canonical. In fact, they said that they were apostate. But Gnostics were quoting the canonical scriptures. And that seems to make the case, doesn't it, that orthodoxy came before heresy?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, Wes mentioned a person by the name of Walter Bauer a minute ago, and his influence here is massive. And people don't actually recognize how influential he is. When he published his original book, Heresy and Orthodoxy in Earliest Christianity, it was in 1934 in Germany. It got kind of lost in the obvious shuffle of World War II. It wasn't until 1971 when it was translated into English that it kind of had its impact. And here's the essence of what Bauer argued. It's what Wes said. Hey, there was no early Christianity. There was only early Christianities, multiple versions of the faith fighting it out for the claim to be original. But here's the next part of the story Bauer said, is that each of these groups has their books, and they claim that their books are the right books. And then why do you have the books in your canon that you have today? Well, because that group won. And if another group had won, you may not be reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You may be reading Philip, Thomas, and Peter. And so here's the payoff of Bauer's view, and it's very postmodern. Basically, the argument is no gospel is any better, any more meritorious, any more authentic than any other. The only reason we have one set of gospels as opposed to another set of gospels is just it's the accident of history. If someone else had won, then you'd be reading another set of gospels. So there's a whole movement in our modern scholarship discussions to never say one gospel is better than another, or one is more right, or one is orthodox, one is correct, one is true. And so now we have scholars saying you can't use terms like apocryphal and canonical. You can't use terms like heresy and orthodoxy. All gospels are by definition equal, and none should be prejudicially elevated above another. Believe it or not, that is the narrative of our modern universities and our modern scholarly scenario. Mm-hmm. And it only works as long as you don't look at the historical data. And when you start looking at the historical data, you realize, wait a second, I'm supposed to say that all gospels are the same, but they're factually not the same. And as you mentioned, Mike, the gospels that represent a much more full version of Gnosticism are obviously downstream from orthodoxy because they're second century phenomenon. We know that the Gnosticism didn't even reach full bloom until really the Valentinian version of it in the middle of the second century. And so all the arrows suggest that actually it wasn't that way. There was gospels that seemed to have predated the larger movement. And when we ask which ones, it's always the same. It's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because people don't realize that they're actually still the only gospels that are dated to the first century, even by secular scholars. You just let that sink in.
Yeah. Interesting, too, that Bauer himself was fascinated with Gnosticism, and Elaine Pagels and so many of the contemporary scholars of early Christianity and Gnosticism are as well. And these are the professors at Harvard and Stanford and you name it, making basically a pitch for the Gnostics. And so it's not unprejudiced.
It's fascinating. I tell my students, I said, I don't know when Gnosticism became the darling of the academy, but for really since the 1970s, there's been this sense that Gnosticism is really the version of Christianity we wish had won. And it's the warm version, it's the inviting version, it's the inclusive version, and the so-called Orthodox Christianity that prevailed is the one we wish hadn't won. The problem is, again, that's a great narrative, but it's not true historically. If you look historically, the Gnostics were not the warm and inviting and inclusive ones. They were actually very elitist. and they're very exclusive, and they're very, we have the secret knowledge, you don't. Ignatius makes numerous comments about how the Gnostics were known for being very unloving and very, very uninterested in the orphan and the widow. So the idea that Gnosticism is the great religion that Christianity could have been, again, that sounds really good in a modern scenario where you're supposed to say all religions are the same. But when you look at it historically, it wasn't the religion it was painted to be.
You know, it's an interesting fact to point out, Dr. Kruger, because I find in not just in the halls of academia, but in the kind of popular culture, there's a preoccupation with Gnosticism as well. New Age philosophy is ingrained and saturated with a preoccupation with the Gnostic Gospels or the Ebionites or these different groups who, like you said, if you were to hop in a time machine and go back in time and actually see what these people were like, they wouldn't be the inclusive group that would jive with a modern New Age person.
They didn't even want to be a part of what they called the great church or the soulish or fleshly church. They didn't want to be included.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I think it's a bit of kind of the symptomatic nature of our subjective society that groups like New Agers who want to piecemeal Christianity and Islam and Buddhism also want to do it to ancient philosophies and religions as well. Because if they actually were respectful to any one of these groups, whether it was Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, or ancient Gnosticism, then they would realize that these are all mutually exclusive, that the secretive nature of the gnosis, of the knowledge that was communicated by the Jesus of, pick your Gnostic gospel, although even some of the Gnostic gospels contradict each other, that wouldn't really be what a lot of people who I talk to, who are the quote unquote spiritual but not religious, would actually want to associate themselves with.
That reminds me of a series of lectures that I attended at Oxford with a professor who filled the largest auditorium, and what he did was, and he was a former evangelical InterVarsity guy, but he had moved in a liberal direction. He each week put up another circle of his Venn diagram of a world religion. And then by the time he finished, and we kind of saw where this was going, all of the overlapping circles at the center were the mystical parts of that religion. And they all unite there. And he actually did have an ecumenical effect on a number of us who, from different religions who went out afterwards for a pint and talked about how condescending it was for a middle-class white European to decide for all the rest of us what our religion really was.
And how all those religions have been wrong. But he basically will say that Christianity is wrong to be exclusive, Islam's wrong to be exclusive. Let me tell you how religion really works.
Yeah, and as if that's not exclusive.
Yeah, exactly.
I think what's a couple of things that are fascinating to me about these Gnostic Gospels, and Mike Kruger is going to be able to get into this when we talk about the canon, is that one of the criteria for canonicity is the book written by an apostle or an associate of an apostle. It's called apostolicity. And these Gnostic Gospels immediately are excluded because they're not from the first century. Now, unless you're holding some very strange views, some people think that the Gospel of Thomas actually goes back to the first century, but that's exceedingly rare to hold to that viewpoint. But I find it interesting that these Gospels, in order to gain some credibility, as Wes was alluding to earlier, they have to put an apostle's name or a well-known person who was an associate of Jesus as the author. So the Gospel of Thomas, you see that very plainly in the Nag Hammadi Codex, that this is the Gospel of Thomas. Our original Gospels, though, did not have any names on them at all. They were all anonymous. And they're not the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark, etc. They're the Gospel according to Matthew and according to Mark. There's one Gospel. And it's not this guy's gospel. It's one gospel, one good news about Jesus Christ. And Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all those who are giving different perspectives and their own personal experiences. Luke, a little bit later, of course, but on who Jesus was. So they made the rise in the number of copies and popularity, not because those names were associated with it from the very beginning in terms of what the author wrote down, but we have these early church fathers who give us a unanimous testimony. The Gospel of Matthew is written by Matthew and Mark by Mark, etc. Even though we don't have those kinds of statements in the, as far as we can tell, the original manuscripts of those Gospels. I think that's pretty significant to show that this other stuff is not considered canonical because it came later.
Mm-hmm.
The Jesus Seminar that Robert W. Funk started several years ago they published a book called The Five Gospels. And this was very much one that wanted to rewrite what the New Testament looked like. The five Gospels included the Gospel of Thomas. And Bob Funk was a master of marketability. He knew how to communicate scholarly issues in lay terms. And so what he did is he actually took these beads that you put into wood after you've put a screw in and it goes in a little bit deeper. You have to put some kind of a piece of wood over it to hide it. That's what he did. He took them in his garage. He took a spray paint and he painted some of them red, some pink, some gray, and some black. I have a set of those beads that he gave to me because we were working on a revision of the Blosterbrenner Funk grammar together for several years. Red meant Jesus definitely said this. Pink meant he may have said it, but certainly the idea goes back to him. Gray means he didn't say it, and maybe the idea goes back to him. Black means this is not Jesus. What's interesting is, even though they admit Thomas is a later document, there is more red in Thomas than there is in the Gospel of John, because they say, look at how early it is. John's earlier, and that's the last Gospel. How can you make these kinds of claims? It's just remarkable how biased they were in these things. And when it came to prophecy, not a single prophecy of the Lord is in red. The whole Olivet Discourse is black, because of course we know that prophecy doesn't exist since there is no supernatural knowledge, someone knowing the future, this kind of thing.